Hello, everyone. Welcome to another week of Record Live. We excitedly are recording in the same place today.
We are together.
It's a rare occurrence, but it's the way to
fun.
Yeah, it is for sure. We actually saw each other not long ago at Digital Discipleship, which we've already kind of hashed on here last week. But something that we spoke about quite a lot at Digital Discipleship that was kind of a common theme was this idea of building trust within our church communities. And I really liked, I don't know if you were aware of that overall thing, you perhaps were, but I really liked your presentation and it really stuck with me, particularly the stories you share. So I don't know if you want to share a little bit about what you spoke about at Digital Discipleship and we can go from there.
Yeah, I did know. Jarrod flagged with me, Jarrod Mann, we had him on a couple of weeks ago on Record Live, and he said his big thing was going to be trust. And I said, that's awesome, because my whole thing is the power of stories. And I talk about that a bit. I do some workshops and I encourage people to share their testimonies, share their stories. And when he said that the theme was trust, my thinking went, well, actually stories can build trust. It seems weird, but it's a really important thing. And you mentioned trust in the church and stuff, but it's also trust in the community and the people outside the church. Like, just to build relationships, it helps to trust someone. So Jarrod started the weekend with some stats about the trust index. There's actually a trust index, and trust has gone down. Trust in the media, especially. Trust in government. Let's not go. The media, the government, the business leaders, there's trends where trust has pivoted to some of those groups, and now it's been lost by some of those groups. And the highest group is actually peers.
Yeah, so which was specifically people who have similar interests and needs to you, which
circles, which is good because, that's how media is being driven by the smartphone. You know, everyone's on getting their 15 minutes of fame. But it's, I guess, got the effect of making echo chambers, like polarizing the society. And we're really seeing that. So Jarrod opened the weekend with that. And then on Saturday morning, I did talk about the power of authentic storytelling. And authenticity is something that I think I've always tried to have in my writing. At first, it was a bit subconscious. And then I think through continuing to exercise that muscle and learning new things and the things that God taught me and the ways that he led me, I think I discovered that it was kind of one of my strengths to make storytelling vulnerable, to make it authentic, is something that I find easy is not the right word, Zanita.
Sure.
It's not easy to do, but it's I understand the power of it for myself because I've seen it change my life. And so I try and model it, because I think you can't do it if no one's ever shared how or demonstrated it for you. So for me, that's been my journey, actually having it modeled in some senses to myself, and then finding ways to become more intentional and to really understand the why of doing that. And that's a little bit of what I shared, I'd say, at Digital Discipleship. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, we're talking a lot about authenticity to build community in this conversation.
Yeah.
But just to clarify, so we're all on the same page, when you say authenticity, what do you mean? Like, when you try to be authentic in your writing, what does that look like?
It's somewhat stripping back the masks, not being keeping up appearances, if you remember that old show. So in other words, being real, being raw. And yes, authenticity has become a bit of a buzzword in a sense, or I've heard it more, transparency, be authentic, be transparent. And people try to do that, and they can do that. They can try to do that using a formula or some kind of, but it doesn't always work, because you can also sense authenticity in a sense. But yeah, really in a nutshell, it's about being real and trying to, for me, I look at, okay, if I want to be authentic, I ask myself, well, what am I dealing with that I think other people will be able to relate to? And then going from that, one of the things when you write, it's like, know your audience, know who you're talking to. And so if you can have a perception of someone might need something, someone might be going through something similar to what I'm going through, you can share on that from a place of not lifting yourself up, but being like, I'm struggling with this. You guys who are reading this or listening to this or doing this, you might be able to find value in this as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so good. I think it's funny when we talk about yourself as a writer, but also people, I think they do this in multiple circles, whatever circles they find themselves in, whether it's at work or whether it's at church. I think a lot of people feel like they can only speak when they know the answer, or they can only write when they have the answer, when they've come to the other side of whatever they're going through. But I think probably when we're our most authentic selves is when we're still in the middle of that and can share how we really are. And that's something that you shared in your presentation, was you shared a story about you and your wife were looking for community and looking for a church, and you went to a church and someone was really honest and open, and that really helps you guys. So I think there is a lot of power in being authentic when we're still in the middle of things.
100%.
Just on the other side.
Yeah, because if we're sharing from the other side, it can often feel discouraging or depressing for people that are in the middle of it, because it feels so far away. Like, when you're, stuck down a big pit, in a hole, and you see the birds flying across the sky, you're like, oh, or a plane even, like, oh, I'll never get to that point. I can't get out of the hole, let alone, and so when we say, oh, I've been through this experience, here's the miracle that happened, here's where I am right now, and it's amazing, it's wonderful. Yeah, good. That's great. That might be relevant to someone, and they can relate to your experience, and they've also been lifted up out of the pit. They're also in a good space. But for someone who's in the pit at the time, they might really struggle with that, because it's actually discouraging because it feels so unattainable at that point. So, but you've got to be conscious of that. Does that mean you shouldn't tell the story? No, not necessarily. And because different people are in different places and they might need that. But yes, it's about not being afraid to tell the story, your story, a story, even though you can't see the end of the story.
Yeah, I remember hearing a friend once, he was going through a period of grief, I suppose, and he was really struggling to come to church because he found it really frustrating to hear people go at the front and share testimonies of how they had lost their keys and prayed, and then God had revealed their keys, or they had fallen pregnant after a long period. But basically what he was saying is, like, all of these stories of people going up the front sharing their answered prayers, which is good, but it's like, how often do you get someone kind of go up the front in church and be like, I'm really struggling, like, but I'm still here, or this is how I'm finding hope. And so I think, it's just interesting because he kind of stopped going to church for a period because he just found that too difficult to constantly be reminded of only the breakthroughs and so I think, that's where vulnerability, I suppose, or authenticity can help people in the middle of things.
Yeah.
When it's just like relatable and not necessarily.
Yep. And you might share from a place of breakthrough, but acknowledging that you're not quite there yet. Like, we're all on journeys, and there's a spectrum of where you're sitting, and some people might have closure and fully healed from something and be really, everything's great, Other people might be like, well, the Lord helped me with this week, help me get out of bed this week, that's a victory, praise God for that. But I'm still struggling with these other things. And so, it's important to recognize that sometimes when we wait to tell the full story, we're diminishing the testimony that we have because we're not actually sharing how God is working. We're not as aware of it either, because we forget by the time when we're full victory, everything's great. We've forgotten some of the victories, the little victories that it took to get us to the big one. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I wonder if you could, I know you shared a story in your presentation. I wonder if you could share that, because I think it's a really cool story in terms of, like, when we're talking about authenticity and community and what that actually looks like.
Yeah. Well, stories are 22 times more memorable than facts.
It's true. And I really liked your presentation, but when you asked me what it was about, I remember the story
yeah,
and the gist of it, but I didn't remember.
because the story encapsulates like the heart of it.
Yeah.
So that's the point. Like, but yeah, my wife and I, we had moved. We weren't married yet at the time, but we were living in Victoria. I was up in Warburton. She was in Melbourne, and then my job moved me to Sydney. So we both made the decision. She moved some months after I did, back in with her parents, and we were like, we had not really connected with the church in Melbourne. So we attended a lot of churches. We bumped in for the service and bumped out before anyone could talk to us. You know, we were in that phase of our lives and we were struggling to get connected. But a friend of my wife's actually that she had gone to Avondale with was like, you should come to our church camp. You have to come. And we're like, so what's it about? You know, you always want to get
suss it out.
Yeah, what's going to happen there? And they're like, it's too hard to explain. Just come. And we're like, oh, this sounds a bit sus. I don't know. What have we got to lose? Let's just go for it. So we attended this weekend, and honestly, from the Friday night, we had tears in our eyes. Like we were, basically it was a weekend of, it's kind of evangelistic, but it was gospel presentations, but they weren't like evangelists. They weren't high profile preachers. They were people from the church.
Just church members.
And they were giving their testimony and using their story to weave into stories like Zacchaeus or, you know, Jesus on the cross and the trials and stuff that he went through. And so we walked through this weekend and we really got the gospel presented to us, which was amazing. But the powerful thing that stood out to me was the stories, the personal stories. And my wife, as I shared on the weekend, my wife had some trauma in her life. She'd had some really difficult, dark seasons. And then that had led to mental health things, which we'd tried to help her to deal with. But these people were just openly talking about some of this stuff, and she could relate, and I could relate to some of it, or was just, even at that point, was just moved by it, even if I couldn't relate like directly. And then the neat thing, I didn't sort of have a lot of time to go into it, but after the presentation, the story and the word, we would have small group time after that.
True.
And so we would unpack like our own stuff. We had a safe space with, you know, for me, 2 or 3 other men. It was gender specific. So the women went with the women, the men went with the men, and the group leaders, if we weren't talking, because I mean, if you've grown up in the Adventist church, you're like, we don't share this sort of stuff at Sabbath school. You know, it's not a safe space necessarily to just do some of that. And yet this weekend, by the end, I could share my struggles and my difficulties, my sin, because it was modeled to me. And these group leaders that were facilitating, they were leading us through. After the word, we would unpack our own lives and went through some exercises and different things. It was a really powerful time, and it gave me a lasting, like, my wife and I drove home and we were talking, and we were like, we've got to go to this church. This is like, what have we got to lose?
Transformative.
It was transformative. The power of those stories especially is what hooked us in. They were good people. We had fun at the church and whatever later, but it was like that introduction was just too powerful, because we saw people who were wrestling and struggling like we were, but they had found a sense of a safe space where they could actually share some of that. And so we attended that church for many years. We got very involved. We went from church hopping, inactive sort of members to missional members, like really. We did a discipleship training course. We did some outreach stuff. We were doing prison ministries. We were involved. We were loving it because of those stories. I would link them as a key. That was the difference to why it made sense, why it made us passionate, because those stories transformed us. And after that, since then, I actually did my master's research in trauma narratives and stuff. And so, I was just looking for evidence that backed up what I had experienced in that transformative, life-changing story. Like, hey, there's power in this stuff. These stories can actually heal, they can help, they can encourage, they can uplift. And I need to understand more and better about how that works. So, I started that program and went through that. And I truly believe that one of the most powerful weapons that God has given us is our own personal journey, our own personal story, because that, when used in community, can actually break down walls. It can help people connect. It's a really powerful tool.
Yeah, I really love that, because I think often we go into churches, like we only go once a week, and a lot of the times we're so busy that we don't have a lot to do with each other throughout the rest of our lives. I know some churches are definitely different and are definitely modeling that a lot better, but a lot of the times we just go to church on Saturday. We don't know what's happening in each other's lives, and then we have these deep, like, theological Bible studies, which at their root are really important and personal, but we just don't go there. We just touch on the theological depth, I suppose, and we just never get to learn about like what each other are struggling with. And I think it's a real missed opportunity a lot of the time, because we could help each other so much more and could encourage each other so much more and pray for each other so much more if we let down some of those guards. But I think that's really hard to do when you all of a sudden come into something like a Bible study group with 20 people, because it's like that can be really hard to let those walls down right there and then. So it's something that has to happen a bit more gradually. But I really love that day.
And modeling it. And this group at one point, it's going to sound weird because it's a bit out of context and you don't understand the journey. So, whatever. But at one point we were writing down our sins on a piece of butcher's paper. And like, that's a really, really hard exercise to do with people you've never met before.
Sure.
It's very awkward, but you very, very quickly, I was, after that time, we were involved in that church for a number of years. We ran, helped. We were part of the team then telling our story. We were doing, reading out, facilitating the small groups, etc. And you very quickly realize that everyone's writing the same things down on the piece of paper. Right? So people might write little, all sin is equal in that it separates us from God, but people write little things that like pride and, and people are like, until someone writes, something a bit more risque. And then all of a sudden everyone's like, but there's not you have to create a non-judgmental safe space to be able to do that. And then you see people writing and they're getting a bit more game and everyone's writing. And symbolically, we, destroy that paper at the end of the program. And it's like, we want to be freed from some of those things. But it was a powerful moment for me in that it was like modeling that actually we've all got the same sins, or we've got different variations, but we're all struggling with stuff.
Yeah.
And when you have it modeled, it's important. But on the flip side of that, it's dangerous to just open up to everyone and anyone. It's not necessarily wise. What do you think are some of the drawbacks of vulnerability?
When you're being vulnerable, you're definitely putting yourself at risk. Not everyone is safe to trust, and not everyone is going to keep what you've shared within those gates. Like, some people are going to talk about it, some people are going to gossip, some people are going to criticize you, some people are just going to be harsh. And I think you have to, I don't know if test is the right word, but I think you do have to be wise and discerning about who you share with, and not necessarily for vulnerability. I think some of us think of vulnerability as just like an emotional vomit, but I don't think it's necessarily that. I think vulnerability can look like a lot of things. It can look like complimenting someone, or it can look like sharing what I actually think about an idea with someone. It can, of course, look like sharing our struggles, our stories as well, but it doesn't just look like a this is everything that's happening in my life. And so I think when you you have to be, I think if you're just starting out with being vulnerable, I think it's probably wise to just do it with one person and just share something smaller. And if they respond well, if they reciprocate well, then maybe share something else or like take away another wall. But yeah, I think within church communities it can be hard because we're often just like thrown into a massive circle or a massive number of people. But I think starting small is good. But it doesn't mean, like, to be honest, I've a few years ago I was really vulnerable with a friend that I was struggling, and it did backfire on me pretty bad, and that person wasn't trustworthy. And
Wow.
I either had the choice then to be like, well, do I just never share with anyone what I'm struggling with again or how I'm feeling, or do I just like learn, I guess, that not everyone can be trusted and, you know, heal from that hurt, because that is like hurtful and it can be hard to do that again. But I think if you just choose to never be vulnerable again, you're never going to have these close, intimate relationships that you desire.
Put up the walls and don't share with anyone, and then you're actually cutting yourself off from potentially even love, because I think at the heart of intimacy and love is transparency, which, you know, if you're not willing to be vulnerable with anyone, you find it very hard to be transparent with, say, your partner, and then you don't go down that road, you know, because you put these walls up, and that can be also very dangerous. I think churches, the challenge for us as a church, though, is to create places, and this church did it really well, whether it's Sabbath school, whether that's too big a group. So maybe you have to split into 2s and 3s at times, or maybe you have to develop cell groups outside of the weekly, you know, Sabbath programs. There's got to be spaces and places for our churches to develop that, because I think really true love can come through that connection, that authentic connection. You know, the disciples in Acts, they're spoken about of having everything in common. You know, many of them were living in common sort of these houses where everyone was just looking out for each other, and you don't think they knew each other's business. I think, do you know what I mean? But that was part of it. There weren't lies and walls and different things between them. So that was an opportunity for sort of true love to flourish and to go well in that community.
Yeah, I had a quote once, and it was saying something like, you can't hate someone unless you I'm going to totally butcher this. You can't hate someone unless you know their story. Like, if you don't know their story, like, because basically it's like, I think a lot of the times when we're critical of people, it's when we don't really understand what's going on, or understand the reason, or understand their past, or like we don't have that like bigger picture, and we just see one thing and we just kind of like cast criticism or, I don't know. And I think it's so often we don't really know those people. You know, I think like I have picked on Sabbath school quite a bit in this, but I do think people, particularly people who are leading Sabbath school groups, can do things to make it a space where people are more likely to be authentic and vulnerable. Like, I think just asking like even just one question in the Bible study that creates more like open conversation. Or
it was interesting at this church in the facilitation training that we did, because it's quite hard to make those small groups vulnerable and opening. And so we did do a little bit of pre-work before we would run a camp like that. It would be like, well, how do we actually facilitate some of this well? And it was like, sometimes you'll get people in your groups that are really overbearing and they'll want to talk all the time, and you have to make space for other people to talk, and you have to, you know, shut down certain conversations, certain opinions that aren't leading anywhere, you know. And I think even just a little bit of that kind of intentional training for some of our Sabbath school leaders would help with that, because I think so often they're just volunteers thrown in the deep end and they haven't actually got a lot of experience doing some of that stuff. So not that it's their fault, it's just, we could be better as a church at actually using Sabbath school as a really intentional space to build our community instead of just, I'll come here and score theological points.
And it's probably, I would guess it's the people who put their hands up to take Sabbath school are probably usually the people who are confident with their theology. And sometimes you have people who are confident with their theology and really aware of like the needs of connection and community and authenticity, but Probably
Not always
Probably not.
the same person.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Just a thought, but yeah.
I'm waiting for your next difficult question. The last few weeks you've thrown out some really good,
fiery,
challenging questions. I like it. So yeah, practically, for me, it's like something that I really, it's not that I always set out to be shocking, or you really have to avoid the temptation to sensationalize a story just to get an emotional reaction. I think, we got to make that point clear as well. It's not just about manipulating people into relationships with you. But one interesting thing I saw, so at the weekend that you're referring to, I did a writing workshop on testimonies, making your testimony better. It was a digital conference, but I was all about the writing because, hey, if you're going to run a channel, if you're going to be digital, it's good to craft things well. Communication skills are important. And so I was looking more at the content of your story and how to tell your testimony well. And so I've got some tips and some tricks, but I actually get my workshop.
Where can people get these?
My workshopees to write, right? Give them 5 minutes, 10 minutes to actually write. And then I made them share with their seatmate, like whoever they were sitting next to. I don't know if I hadn't noticed it before. It was just the context of the weekend and just how it came together, because we were talking about building trust, breaking down walls and building bridges, etc. I was watching them as they shared, because if you don't practice the tips you've just been given, you'll forget. 2 days later, you'll be gone from the conference. You'll never do it again. And you'll maybe have the lie, I can't write. I can't tell my story. So I make them do it there on the scene during the workshop. And they were sharing, like you and I would share. We would sit next to each other. I'd read my story. You'd read your story. And what I would see is this. Here's my story. This and this and this happened to me. And then they would look at each other and they would give context. Oh, well, I didn't finish, but this is where I'm thinking. And you would see them interacting, engaging. And then the other person would read their story. And then they had these conversations. They weren't looking at what they'd written anymore, but they were having a conversation. And my whole point was, if you're ready with your story, if you know the things that God's doing in your life and you're ready to share that with someone in an authentic way, that will break down walls and that will help them to relate to you because you've just shared your story. And I just saw all these people, many of them didn't walk in together. They were just sitting, and then they got paired up with someone they didn't know. They were connecting. They were laughing, smiling, enjoying the experience. And it was like, wow, a real world sort of example. It's not just theory.
Yeah.
Telling your story to someone else actually makes them connect. And I was chuffed to see it happen, like right in front of me. It was just a simple exercise. They wrote for 10 minutes and then they start talking, and they could have talked for another 3 hours. Like the barriers were broken. They were ready to go. And I just think, that's the power. It just reminded me again this weekend of the actual power of authentic stories and the way that we can actually use those stories to build community, to bring people together and to relate to other people in a way that will help them with their story. God uses our stories almost to enter other people's stories in that sense. So it was a powerful reminder for me.
It's going to be a practical activity for our listeners, is to write down some story.
Workshop with Jarrod. All right, you ready? Spend 10 minutes or so. It's called a napkin testimony. Can you write your testimony on a napkin, a small piece of paper? Do it this week. Just write out something that God's done for you in your life recently, or something that he's doing currently. And it's really good. One, it helps you to process and remember. So it means actually when you have a conversation with your hairdresser or the person at the shops that's serving you, etc., you're ready with that story if they say something. It's always important to listen first. You don't just go around telling people your story. You listen to what they're sharing. But if you've got something that's ready, and you don't have to read it then because you've internalized it because you've written it out. But you write your story down this week. If you think, oh, this is actually good, I'd love to share it, send it to us. editor@record.net.au. If you send me an email, I'd love to read your story. We love getting testimonies at Record. And it may or may not ever be printed. If you just do this exercise this week, you can just keep it for yourself and just know that you've done that. But just engage with your own story, and it might help you make a connection with someone this week. And we'd love to hear if that is actually the case. If you write your story out and then find someone in the shops that you tell that story to, and then you're like, wow, this is a really cool connection. They're coming to church, or we just got to know each other better. I've seen this lady across the road for 15 years and never spoken to her. We'd love to hear how it's working for you as well.
I'll share it with someone in your church community if you can't find someone across the street.
Yeah. 100%.
Oh, yeah, Napkin Testimonies. That should probably be the title of this week's podcast, I reckon.
You reckon?
I think it's interesting. I'd be intrigued.
Let's do it.
All right. Well, thank you, Jarrod, for sharing. It's been great to hear about, your experience with sharing stories. We know you're a story guru yourself, so they're learning from the best. But go out there, be authentic, be transparent, and, build community.
Yeah, we'll see you next week on Record Live. God bless.